Hello, Siri. How are you?
Hello, Hugo. How are you?
Let's pretend we were not talking before.
We were talking before, so we can't hide it. And we had a nice little conversation about New York City.
Yes, and we'll talk about New York City because New York, it's I found that it's one of the main characters of your latest novel, Recordações do Futuro, which I have here. I don't know if you can see it. There's a light, but okay,
Yeah.
like this is
Yep,
the cover.
There it is.
In a minute, I'll do a short introduction in Portuguese for our
Fine.
Portuguese viewers, but I would like you to welcome to the third edition of this event, Arquipélago dos Escritores. If we weren't living through a pandemic year, probably we would be together in the Azores Islands, islands, and the archipelago would be talking face-to-face live. But now I'm in Lisbon and you're in Brooklyn, New York, right?
Absolutely. I'm in Brooklyn in my study upstairs in a house I've lived in for many years.
So if you don't mind, I'll change to Portuguese just for half a minute to make an introduction, and then we'll jump back to English again. Is that okay?
Just fine.
Então, estamos aqui hoje com a escritora norte-americana SIRI HUSTVEDT. É uma escritora que tem livros publicados de poesia, de prosa, toda uma obra ensaística considerável e amplamente traduzida. É autora de 7 romances, na sua grande maioria está publicada em Portugal, entre eles O Verão Sem Homens, Aquilo que eu Amava, O Mundo Ardente, e o mais recente, como eu disse, Recordações do Futuro, publicado pela Dom Quixote. Tem também uma vida académica vastíssima. Recentemente, em 2009, recebeu o prémio Princesa das Astúrias, aqui ao lado em Espanha, e tanto nos ensaios como na ficção mantém um diálogo entre as humanidades e a ciência. O seu livro mais recente, Recordações do Futuro, é aquilo que se pode chamar uma memória ficcionada, em que a narradora aparece apenas com as iniciais SH, que são também as iniciais da autora, e tal como a autora, se mudou para Nova Iorque no final dos anos 70 para ser escritora vinda do Minnesota. Na verdade, este livro são 3 livros, não só porque a narradora encontra um diário do seu primeiro ano em Nova Iorque, em 1978, encontra esse diário quando visita a mãe no Minnesota, e este livro conta também, ainda com partes de um romance não publicado pela narradora, escrito nesse primeiro ano em Nova Iorque. É um romance, não deixa de ser um romance ficcionado, e que brinca muito com a forma. Tem várias formas dentro da mesma forma. Okay, let's go back to English. I don't know if you got anything. You speak French, right?
Yeah, I understand a few phrases here and there, partly because I think it relates to things that I know, but no, my Portuguese is dreadful.
Well, let's start with I was talking about the structure of your novel. You know, it's like different books inside the same book. And I once heard the story of a literary agent scolding one of her writers for not being part of any genre in specific. She said she couldn't label his work. You know, it's not crime, it's not fantasy, it's not memoir. And that makes it pretty hard for me to sell your book, she said.
Right.
And to which he asked, what do you mean? It's literature. And she said, well, that's the problem. It's literature. That's so. I remember this story when I was reading your book, because it's a fictionalized memoir. It's a diary. It's an unfinished first novel. It has poetry. It has reflections about art, science. It has humor. I laughed lots of times. I had a good time reading this book.
I'm very happy to hear that.
And someone wrote about this book that it's kind of a Pandora box. But I don't know if that's the best image, because everything is so beautiful put together that for me it resembles more a jazz piece, you know? I wonder if your agent had problems with the structure of this novel.
Well, I think, I'm so old now and I've been around for a while. So what I do is accepted, but I also think that reviewers, for example, often have a hard time uh, placing the work. I mean, human beings are creatures of categories, right? We perceive the world through these preordained categories. And I think if you're messing around with them, if you're even just having fun with those categories, it can be hard for people to place a book in a comfortable place, right? People like to recognize what they already know. And for me, literature that I care about, that I've cared about in my life, has always been literature that jiggles those categories around and makes me see the world in a somewhat different way. So I'm not really interested in reprising what's already happened or fulfilling the requirements of a particular genre. And I think that can be difficult for writers who, are not interested in replicating the conventions of the past. Now, this book is playing with a lot of conventions from the 18th century novel. There are moments when the narrator speaks directly to the reader. There are a number of references to books I love, both Don Quixote, but also Lawrence Stern. And that was an 18th century novel that played like crazy with philosophy, for example, and ideas. So yeah, this book I wanted to have some fun actually with preordained categories and large cultural narratives that I wanted to resist over the course of the book.
Very well. After I read the first 20 pages of the novel, I felt that I was traveling with the narrator through her New York memories, and they were such vigorous memories, full of color and compelling references, from writers to places, that I think the reader kind of feels the same experience as the narrator when she arrived in New York in 1978. In a way, it reminded me of Repazine Blue playing in the beginning of Woody Allen's Manhattan, because it's so it takes you to New York in a way, even though the images are completely different from Manhattan's Woody Allen. I think this is more I wouldn't go as far as say punk, but it's definitely not black and white. But this sequence, more than the images, I think puts the reader in that state of mind of everything that's still lying ahead, the illusional, typical of the young, of what will be. And New York hyperbolizes that sense. Are those the memories of the future that you refer in the title? The things that are still to happen?
Yes, and actually there are really two narrators, as you pointed out earlier. There's the young narrator of the diary, and then there's the old narrator who has discovered the diary and is commenting on the younger self in many ways. So part of her memory of what that was like, which is enhanced by the diary, is what one can never have again. And I know this well, I'm 65 now. You can never have that sense of an open future that you have when you're young. And the glory of that openness is, of course, that you don't know what's going to happen. Later in life, there's one moment in the book where she says, the funnel, life it's a funnel. It opens up when you're a young person. And that direction changes as you get older. you know, the choices you've made, what's happened to you, you realize that the future is much smaller than the past. But also, I'm deeply interested in the idea of the future as an entirely imaginary place, right? The future is endlessly deferred. You never enter it. The very nature of the future is that it's always ahead of you. And in order to think about the future, you need to use the material of the past. You know, we expect the future because we can remember the past, right? And the fictional aspect, I think, is quite important. We are always throwing ourselves into an imaginary future.
It's funny because when you were talking about the image of the funnel, you know, I think you used the image of light because it gets less light than when you're young, you know. And I don't think that this book is nostalgic about youth in a way that, oh, you know, I want to be young again.
No.
But there's no, not at all. But about this sense of what could happen again, you know, this sense of novelty that as you go out through life, it kind of wears out. It's just the way it is, right?
Yes, and I also think what interested me about, you know, as I was writing the book, I began to realize too that one of the things we do as human beings who are able to recover ourselves in the past and imagine ourselves in the future is that as we look back on the past, we also revise it, right? Memory is not a machine. Memory is edited, and it's edited by present realities. So part of the story is the older narrator revisiting the past and rewriting it in certain ways. So at the very heart of the book, there's a sexual assault. And that memory is a, you know, it's a traumatic memory. And I think the second half of the book is first repeating and repeating and obsessing over this memory, and then eventually finding a way to articulate the narrator's rage and transforming it, you know, over the last course of the book. So it's about remembering, about time, and about the imaginary, and the imaginary includes the future.
Well, memory, as you said, is a great part of this novel, you know, even the dialogue that the older narrator maintains with the younger narrator. And more than once, you write about this idea that memory and imagination are often the same.
Yes.
And as usually writers know that, you know, because memory is a tool that they definitely need to do their job.
Yes.
Why do you think this is, memory and imagination being the same? Is that because we need to make sense of our stories, so we edit our own life, or do you think it's a evolutionary trait to keep us alive? Because just as you said that she obsesses with the assault, and at a certain point you cannot obsess with the traumatic experience, it's a way for us to be able to live our lives without being burdened by the weight of memory.
Right. So it's a very interesting question, right? And you were the one who brought up evolution. In evolutionary terms, we can ask ourselves, what is the past? What is memory for? What is the kind of memory we have for? Well, it's not to get a perfectly accurate perception of the past. The past for an organism doesn't really matter. What matters is how the organism, or let's say human being, uses that memory to guide her or him into the future, right? You know, so that, I mean, there are very simple kinds of memories. You know, the child who touches a hot stove learns that that's not a good place to go because of the pain. You know, it's a very simple kind of thing. But in more sophisticated ways, young people who have experiences will learn, for example, to stay away from another person who seems to be ominous or threatening in some way. And a lot of that is learned, and it helps the person navigate her way into the future. That is an evolutionary thing. So why do we edit them? I think that it turns out, even in neurobiology, that there's a little part of the brain called the hippocampus. And if you have injury to this little part of the brain that has been connected to memory and navigation, you not only have trouble remembering, you have trouble imagining. So there's a little neurobiological factum that is interesting in terms of very much older ideas. Giambattista Vico, the I think great Italian historian and philosopher, linked memory and imagination very closely, and he linked them to the body. He was writing against Descartes, and I too am an anti-Cartesian. So I think there are lots of reasons to think about memory and imagination as linked faculties, at the very least, possibly the same faculty. So
do you have any idea why? I know that you've studied and wrote about neurological issues. The character, after the traumatic experience, goes through this process, which is very common, of thinking, what could she have done differently?
Yes, yes.
And she obsesses with that, you know?
Yeah.
From guilt, from imagination, from imagining other sceneries where she could have avoided what happened.
Exactly.
And that is very common. Even I had a couple of years ago, I had an experience of, I would say, small violence with another man in the street. And for the next 24 hours, I was obsessing with it. Like, maybe I shouldn't have replied to his insults. Maybe I should have gone away. Maybe I should have done that.
Exactly.
Why do you think that we go over and over to the same experience instead of just moving away? And maybe we could talk about meditation later, because I know you meditate, and how that helps us to to leave that behind, to leave the moment behind.
So it's interesting that you bring this up, because violent experience is shocking to us. It's shocking to other animals too. And I think the reason that we keep going back, and I think it is she does articulate this in the book, that by going over what you might have done differently, it's actually a form of giving yourself more volition and more power, right? Now, many of these incidents, there's very little one could have done. And, the danger in it is that the person takes on the guilt that belongs to the other, right? Instead of, because you say, if I had only done this, then it wouldn't have happened, et cetera, et cetera. But it did happen. And the person who committed the violent act is the guilty party. This is very important to understand. And, my heroine does understand it eventually, but she also blames herself. But by blaming herself, she gives herself, in fact, more volition, more will than she actually had, right? She gives herself more power in the situation. And I think that's why we obsess about how it could have been different, because it's actually a way of taking on responsibility, whereas the world is not always like that, right? There are many things that happen to us in the world that we can't help, but the feeling of agency, that is necessary for human beings to go on living. We have to feel that what we do matters and that we will it.
But especially for women, how much of it's cultural, in a way that we all know that victims of sexual violence usually don't not only feel blame themselves, but are blamed by others.
Yes.
Even the other day, I was writing this study about sexual violence that was done in the United States, and the researcher was saying that there's a lot of police officers that don't understand that a husband or a boyfriend can rape their partner. And she even quotes. She asks the detective, like, do you think that a woman can be raped by her partner? And he said, well, it maybe, but it's difficult. So yes, I know.
This is but I mean, it is a really fascinating business, and I've thought a lot about this. I think that this kind of sexual molestation or sexual harassment, sexual violence, it is one of those strange events in human life after you pick it apart, which is that women are often blamed, for the desire or rage or whatever is motivating the man who's committing the violent act. She is the one somehow responsible for the feelings that he's having, whether they're rage or sexual arousal or whatever it might be. Now, that in the culture generally doesn't go in the reverse. For example, I cannot remember in my life blaming a man for my desire for him, right? I don't hold him responsible for my feelings. My feelings are my feelings. And after that, he either wants me or doesn't want me. But what happens in the strange hierarchy of sexual politics is that the woman is blamed for the man's feelings. I have felt this hundreds of times. And in the book, what is happening is very interesting, because what that man is doing to my heroine is punishing her for her intelligence. He finds himself on an evening, a kind of pickup date with this woman who turns out to have read lots of books, has lots of opinions, and by the end of the evening does not want him anymore. And he is so enraged by this that he decides she needs punishment, because he deserves to act out his own feelings without her being in the way. And that is a common business. And that is why men cannot understand, or some men cannot understand, why a husband could possibly rape his wife, because she's a kind of extension of the man, extension of his feelings, extension of what he needs. And that's something that has to stop.
There's this scene when she goes to have dinner with the witches, and
Yes.
that she once again there's a man that is being condescending towards her, and she finally replies, and she replies with anger, and she teaches him a lesson, but then she collapses.
Yes.
And
I find it very funny. I laughed my head off when I wrote that scene. I'm sorry, but I really find it very funny.
But it's really funny, but it's also very, very truthful, because there's still this sense that women cannot be angry. If they're angry, they're nasty. As we know that that word became part of the of our time, calling women nasty. Like, if a man in an office screams at someone, is just being a man, he's being masculine, he's imposing his authority. If a woman screams at someone, she's being crazy. So anger is just another emotion, just like sadness, so it's not wrong to be angry. I mean, the anger exists for a reason, evolutionary as well.
Yeah.
We cannot be enslaved by it, but women are not allowed to be angry.
No,
right?
and, you know, it's fascinating. It was not so long ago, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the scholar's name, but she was writing a paper about the Greeks, you know, our forebears in ancient Greece, and the fact that rage or anger was an emotion reserved for men in power. And I think we have continued this tradition. I was, you know, fascinated by the Brett Kavanaugh hearings in the United States, the Supreme Court now justice, who was accused of sexual assault by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. She sat there like the perfect lady all through. She never showed the slightest anger. He, on the other hand, was allowed to rant and rave and show tears of anger. And I thought, this continues. Power, rage and power go together. So it's the people who are disempowered, and, you know, this is largely true of women, who are not allowed to be angry. And it's men in power, and in my country, that's white men in power, who feel that their rage is justified and are allowed to show it without recrimination. So my poor heroine, who is actually discovering the rage that she's suppressed, and this man, you know, acts as if she's never read a book of philosophy in her life when she's actually very up on things. And she gets so angry that she makes this really articulate, angry response to a philosophical question, and is arrogant enough to quote Wittgenstein in the German while she does it. And then she's so shocked at her own response that she faints. And I thought of that as a young woman on the way to being able to both recognize and articulate and live with unapologetically her own rage.
Later on that same dinner, Patty, one of the witches, tells her that the world loves powerful men but hates powerful women.
Yes.
This was set in 1978, and of course things have changed. But do you still find that that's true? I mean, if we think about, I don't want to go into politics, but if you think about the reaction that Hillary Clinton had on some of the voters for being a woman, not only for being a woman, but for some for being a woman. Do you think that's still true, what Patty said, that the world hates powerful women?
Yes, I think it's true. And I think we see it in instances, you know, like the Hillary Clinton candidacy. But what really fascinates me is I think that Western culture, the only culture I can really speak for, and I know other cultures as well, there's a big problem with women having authority. So what authority is? Legitimate power, right? That's what authority is. It's legitimate power, and it's acknowledging a woman's authority for, again, not all men, but for a number of men and women, by the way, is difficult because it means looking up to her. It means assigning her that position of authority. Now, for some men, that's really emasculating, right? It makes them feel that they're being dominated in some way, and it can induce feelings of intense discomfort and even shame. This is not talked about very often, but I think it should be talked about, that the hierarchy is so deep and it's so inside many of us, including, as I point out, I mean, women who are very uncomfortable with women in authority as well. Yes, I think it goes on. And I think it comes out in some very strange ways, in inappropriate anger and inappropriate rage in certain circumstances, if men and some women feel that a woman is, embracing her own power and her own authority. I think that could be very threatening to lots of people.
Some people have said, I've read that it's a feminist novel, and it was written during the Me Too movement, when it was a big story in the media, and yet sometimes when you say feminist, you think about political activism, but I just see it as a novel. First and foremost, it's a novel. It seems that you are writing a truthful story, because that's what happens to women. And if you have women friends, and if you're a man, if you ask them about these things, you understand. You will understand the crescendo that happens in your book, because it starts with small condescending actions towards her, small aggressions. The man that tell her to smile, dear. I'm sure every woman has heard that in their lives. The way they see Norman Mailer at a party, and the man that stabbed his wife, and it was still in the 70s a big literary figure and political star. The way that she mentions that her dissertation was judged by 6 white men, and even when she goes back and she remembers the way her father told her, when she told her father that she wanted to be like him, before her father was a doctor, she says, "Oh, you can be a nurse." So he didn't say you can be a doctor like I am. No. And these aggressions, they are not all, like it happens, sexual assault. No. But it's an everyday continuum, condescending attitude, or a sequence of aggressions that usually women are the end of, and that men sometimes, it's not that they don't have empathy, it's that they don't understand that. They haven't lived through it, so they cannot put themselves in their places, right? Right. And I think, it's not all men. So I think what happened during the Me Too movement, actually I had already written the sexual assault by the time the Me Too movement happened. So I was still at the end of the book, but it didn't actually inform the writing of the book. It just occurred in a way, simultaneously with my making of this book. But I think what the Me Too movement did, at least in the United States, was that it facilitated some discussions between men and women. And I know that among my own male friends, and even my husband, he was startled by the number of incidents that, women he cares about recalled, and not just with strangers, but with people you knew, incidents on dates, again, not necessarily violent or terrible things, but, harassing, unpleasant, often cruel events that, as you say, build up over time. And it's really hard to find a woman who hasn't experienced them. And I think that came as a surprise to a number of men, and that the discussion is really healthy, and that it can help move the culture in a direction which can create a more dignified boundary, right? So that men are not blaming women for their own feelings. If a woman is wearing a bikini and a man feels lust, it's not her fault, right? It's not her fault. She doesn't have the feelings. So this is something that needs to be discussed. And again, I think sometimes we fall into these cliches and platitudes about what's really going on, and they need to be thought about in fresh ways, so we don't fall into this kind of boring
cliche discussion of what.
And I also think that some men, like you said, feel threatened, but manhood can still be something good, can still be something attractive, can bring good things to the world. Manhood doesn't have to be toxic or create damage in other people. But I don't think that some men understand that. If you talk about masculinity in these terms, they think that, okay, now I have to cease to be a man and be some other thing.
Right.
And I think that discussion is also needed to clarify, because like you said, sometimes men are afraid and they feel threatened, which they should.
Yeah. Well, there's a term. Yeah, go ahead.
No, because picking up this idea, I have the Portuguese edition, so I cannot read it to you, but there's this passage about, now that we're talking about men, about the groupies of the Columbia professor, Sylvain Lontringer. I don't know if you say the name
yeah.
like that.
L'étranger.
And yeah, L'étranger. Okay, he's French. And she says that they were all white boys attracted by the most transgressive elements of modern thought and the heroic sciences of sacrifice. We're talking about intellectual students. We're talking about boys that went to Columbia. But this transgressive want, this need to be to show their masculinity, also shows up in other different groups, like the Proud Boys. And so, do you think this is typically male, that it happens in academia as well? It happens in places where men get together with their automatic rifles to scare someone in their pickup trucks?
Right. Well, yes, I think it's important that we don't that we understand that this kind of masculinity politics, if you will, goes on in a number of different places in the culture. It's not only in right-wing places, but the idea, I think, is that there's something in sociology, they call it precarious masculinity. The idea that if you're a woman, you're just a woman. You have the genitalia and that's it. But being a man means continually proving your masculinity. In other words, an Adam's apple, a penis, and hair in various places does not make you a man. And that idea that it's performative, that you're constantly proving yourself over and over. So, if you order a green salad at lunch, that's feminine, right? If you order a steak, that's masculine. Now, these things are so silly if you think about them, but nevertheless, they are markers of femininity and masculinity in the culture. And we should, I think, reevaluate. Physics is masculine and poetry is feminine, at least in the United States. How does that work exactly? Science is hard and masculine, and the arts are soft and feminine. Well, there are long, history and traditions, going back to before the scientific revolution, for why this is the case. But it's silly. Why do we assign, sexual attributes to things that clearly have no sex, like mathematics or salad? It's like it's not feminine, but it's an idea again, and that unlike women, men are constantly having to prove it. And that the politics of that kind of masculinity, I think, can be very dangerous, and they can lead to, things as frightening as gun culture or the Proud Boys, who feel deeply offended by the rise of women in the culture, right? What do they feel? It's not that women are threatening male positions so much. It's that the very sight of a woman rising into a position of authority is something that makes them feel ashamed and less than.
You were talking about the green salad, and it reminded me of this joke that an American comedian told, that he said in the 90s everyone was rollerblading, you know, men were rollerblading, and then someone made a gay joke about rollerblading, and men ceased to rollerblade. You never saw a man rollerblading again in Central Park. And it's quite like that. It's either rollerblading or green salads. Men cannot have both. But you were saying how our society looks at art as the art something feminine, soft, and now I'm quoting you, imaginary, and serious. And you say, now quoting you, that male novelists hardens and dignifies the form, while a female novelist is doubly penalized as a woman working in an unserious form. And you say that this distinction maybe is the reason why male writers have an equal number of men and women readers, while female writers are read primarily by women.
Yeah.
Do you really think this, that men have more men and women reading them, and female writers have more female readers?
Actually, it's statistically true. It's actually, it's a fact. It's not, I'm not just guessing.
No. I know that usually women are they buy the books, they are the readers, and there are more women reading novels than there are men.
Absolutely. And I think that's also because, again, there's something suspicious and feminine about the imaginary itself. But if you're going to read a novel and you're a heterosexual man, you will read the man as opposed to the woman. And that's because it's easier to submit yourself to the authority of a man than to a woman. And it can feel humiliating to open a book with a woman's name on it, because it makes a man feel that he's allowing himself to be possessed by that woman's voice.
Siri, couldn't it also be just that you identify more with the world vision or experience of a man because you're a man as well?
No, I don't think so. Because I think, first of all, literary men who really care about literature do read women. And I also think that women read huge numbers of books written by men. And, you know, I can think of, I think of writers that I love. The reading engagement is not about sexual difference, right? So reading engagement, when I'm reading Kafka, I'm K. I'm not the maids, right? I mean, I'm K. And when I read, Dostoevsky, I'm in a number of the characters, but I certainly identify more closely with many of the male characters than I do with the female ones. So I think that's not what reading is. Reading is entering the voices of others. And it's only, in a way, people who are not perhaps deeply steeped in the greatness of literature who have these biases. There are great writers of all sexes.
Yes, of course. I would like to go back to memory, because we were talking about memory, and then we started talking about other things. But and because it's such a big part of your novel, and so interesting. At a certain point, you say that I'm sorry. In an interview, you said that. No, in the novel. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes. In the novel, you say that if you are one of those readers who relishes memoirs filled with impossibly specific memories, I have this to say: those authors who claim perfect recall of their hash browns decades later are not to be trusted.
Right.
Do those kind of memoirs get on your nerves?
Yes.
When they know they write like 10 pages of dialogue when they were 12 years old?
Yes. Or 4 years old. I mean, it's wild. Now, I think there is something about writing itself. I mean, I noticed this. I mean, certainly in fiction. But even when you're trying to tell a story, say a true story from your own life, there is a natural tendency to fill in what isn't there. you know, it's part of the fictionalizing of our reality, of our memory. But some of these memoirs are so precise that it's absurd. No one, or very, very few people, only a savant, you know, there are a few of those in the world, could remember with such detail. In fact, after we leave each other today, I will think about the gist of our conversation and say, you know, I had a really nice talk with Hugo. It was fun. But I will not be able to recreate word by word most of what was said, except for perhaps a few lines that, you know, you had and a few lines that I had. Memory does not work like that. We're not tape recorders.
So you think it's intellectually dishonest when someone does that?
I do.
Okay.
Maybe because I'm, you know, grew up a Lutheran girl in the middle of the Midwest,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I think there's something dishonest about it. And there might be, you know, in the United States, we have this very hard line between fiction and nonfiction. And a memoir is really supposed to be true to the person's memory. Clearly, many of the memoirs that are published now are highly fictionalized texts. Yeah. And I think if the reader understands that, that's okay. But there have been some, you know, literary scandals of, you know, people completely reinventing what's supposed to be a factual account of their own lives. And I resist that. And it might be, you know, my own moral compunctions. But when I write about my own life, which I do, or tell stories that are trying to illustrate a point, I really do it to the best of my ability, and I leave blank what I cannot fill in.
At a certain point in the novel, the narrator writes, while navigating in the strange regions of memory, we jump from hero to hero, from moment to moment. And that was exactly what I felt as a reader. Because you go from Ronald Reagan and the AIDS epidemic to her childhood ballet shoes in Minnesota, but yeah. It feels very organic. It feels like the reader is part of the flow of consciousness. Because that's how memory works. We don't know why we remember something. You know, the process of association, we have no control whatsoever, and it's a great mystery. I mean, still for people that are studying it, it's still a great mystery. And at a certain point, she writes that she doesn't know who's writing, that the writing doesn't come from her.
Right.
But I think it's a very mystic and beautiful image. But if you know the craft of writing, that's not what happened. I mean, you didn't sit down and it just came to you. I mean, there's a lot of literary craft in what you've done. Yes. I say this is a compliment.
So no, so listen, I actually had a lot of trouble writing this book. I wrote another book, which I failed at and put it away. And that other book was also about memory. There was also a traumatic incident. It was, you know, long and complicated. I had about 200 pages of this novel that I finally realized was not working at all, and it just needed to die, which I happily consigned it to its grave. But by writing, I think that those 200 failed pages, it sharpened me. I understood that I was actually writing too much from the outside, that I was trying to exercise too much control over the text. And when I had the idea for the new book, which was that the narrator is hearing a woman through the wall, that was really how it started, which I was going to put into the old book to kind of perk it up. And then something happened with that idea, with listening, you know, which is also like reading, right? You're listening to the voice of another. And then the book seemed to click. I seemed to have these different balls in the air. And according to my own lights, I succeeded at the book that I ended up writing. But what is amazing to me then is that once you get the things going, you are able to allow things to come. I mean, late in a book, it often does begin to write itself. And I don't know who's writing. And of course, as you say, the associations that come to us, when you're writing and, or, thinking through something, they rise up from somewhere. Of course, it is in the person, but, who's speaking? That's not always so clear. We are occupied by the voices of many people, writers especially.
Still about memory, at a certain point, the narrator asks herself, should we celebrate or mourn memory loss? Again, we go back to that idea of the evolutionary benefits of not remembering everything.
Right.
And I don't know if you have an answer to that question of your narrator. Should we celebrate or
lament? It comes out of actually a real experience that I share with my narrator, SH, is that she has a mother in the book who's losing her memory, who's old. And actually, last October, my mother, not this October, but October 2019, my mother died at 96. So
I'm sorry.
From the time, I miss her. She was old, but I miss her. But after she turned 90, her memory started to go. And it didn't go quickly, fortunately. She remembered everything about her early life. She remembered her children, but she stopped remembering what you just said to her. And I used my own mother in the book as she said a lot of the things that the mother says in the book. And she, so she lost the connection between the past and the present and the immediate future, which is, of course, not like points, but a kind of pull from one into the other, from remembering to the expectation of what's going to happen. And with, people who suffer from dementia, that's what happens. Should we mourn it? Well, some forms of forgetting, as you said, are really important. And even my mother's dementia that did get increasingly worse, she did not lose her being. She did not lose herself. We are not only made of our memories of the past. We're made of emotional connections. We're made of strong feelings. And so I felt that I had lost certain aspects of my mother, but certainly not the whole person.
Now that you mention your mother and the mother in the book, which provides beautiful moments in the book, not only when she's having these conversations when she's in the home with her daughter when she's already 94, but also that allows the narrator to go back to her childhood and as beautiful moments. But the narrator says that she writes against mortality. And in a way, it sounds that she's talking about herself, but I think that she also is referring to her mother, because there's this sense that when her mother is gone and she already lost her father, something utterly important is gone from your life. There's a certain point, I don't know what it is because I still have my father alive.
Good.
But there's a certain point that when you lose both parents, I imagine that something utterly changes in you, in your experience of being alive, right?
I think so. I think so. It's strange, and I think you can't really anticipate it. But I recognize that I'm still mourning my mother, and I think I will till the day I die, and that something has fundamentally changed. Some kind of protective reality, at least in my case. I know, we all have different relations with our parents. But for me, my mother was a protective force, emotionally, psychologically. And the fact that she's gone has changed something fundamental in my inner life too. And perhaps it's, often said that when your parents die, you look straight into death. there's nothing,
Wow.
There's nothing there, before
Yeah.
you. Now we could all die, many people die young, they die as children even, but in what we think of or imagine as the natural course of things, parents precede their children. And so when your parents die, you recognize, I think, very deeply how much closer you are to your own mortality than before.
There's also this mention about remembering together when the narrator goes back to Minnesota and she's remembering with her sister the sound that the ice. How do you say it in the ice? How do you say it in English?
The ice skates make.
Yeah,
on
the sound
ice. Yeah.
on ice. Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And it's true. I never thought about it because usually the act of remembering, it's very lonely. Even if you're walking on the street and there's a sense of smell.
Yeah.
But what do you think changes, especially with someone that goes back so far back, like a sister? What changes in the experience of remembering when you have someone to remember with?
Oh, yeah, I think these are deeply shared. It's a way to recover a shared past, right? And the pleasure that brings. I've noticed this I have 3 sisters, not one as my narrator has, but I have 3 sisters. And of course, we've been separated by the pandemic, but when in our normal lives, 2 of them live in New York and 1 lives in Minnesota. But when the 4 of us are together, often around Christmas time, we will sit and do what's almost like a memory game. Do you remember, when we were here or there, as a family? Do you remember when our father said this or that? And the intense pleasure of sharing that past is, I think, it's a kind of connective tissue in a family. Now, sometimes my sisters remember things that I have totally forgotten, or I'll remember something important and they have no idea what I'm talking about. Well, it's not.
Isn't it like an emotional dialect between members of family?
Yeah.
Like a way to feel part of something, and like a time travel machine, because I have 3 brothers, not 3 sisters.
Okay.
And we go back to the same stories over and over, the same jokes, the same. And we know the end of the joke, we know the end of the story, we know the characters that we're referring to. But each time the repetition gives us a sense of proximity and of belonging to something, and maybe that's it. It feels that makes you feel that you belong to something.
Yes, and I think repetition is essential to ritual, and families need repetitions that become rituals, and they help to hold us together, to create lasting bonds that go actually across death. My mother was a Norwegian Christmas person. She loved Christmas, and she had all kinds of rituals that she taught to her daughters and now her sons-in-law and her grandchildren. And by reenacting those rituals every year, I think we are able to feel a connection to the dead generations. You know, the ghosts are with us in the rituals.
I was, I don't want to dwell on your mother's death, but there's something that when someone dies that knew us when we were little, that watched us grow up, something dies as well, because there are memories of you, parts of you that you don't even remember, that she was the only one holding it.
Of
So
course.
maybe that's also very symbolic for us, because something is, like we said, is utterly lost, something that we cannot get back with photographs, not get back with conversations with our siblings, right?
No, 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 there's no question that, you know, death creates significant and important losses for us. And that it's good. I mean, my father wrote about his own life in a memoir for his children and friends and family. My mother also wrote a few memories about her own childhood, and of course, I've treasured them very deeply. And after she died, I wrote a long essay that's coming out in a book next year about mothers and motherhood and my own mother. Because I guess I want to scratch her into the world a little bit in the form of a text, right? So that woman, or some stories about that woman, can, you know, go on through her daughter who loved her.
Let's go to lighter subjects now.
Okay.
And about your rituals of writing. I know that you wake up very early,
Yeah.
and I see that as time goes along, most writers, as though they grow old, they start preferring writing in the morning. Usually, writers write at night when they're younger.
Yes, I did that
Because in
too.
the yeah, and I found out, I was surprised that you start out with meditation before you write, and I wanted to talk to you about it, a little about it, because I don't know of many writers that meditate, but which makes a lot of sense, because usually writers spend a lot of time inside their heads, you know, the constant chattering that can be a burden when I mean, and anyone who has read your work might figure that you think a lot, right? And that you spend a lot of time thinking. Did you, how did you find out about meditation?
Yes.
What
No, it's not very glamorous. I have suffered from migraines my whole life, and I had a very bad period when I was still young in my 20s. I had had a headache for a year, and it just never went away, and it was more and less brutal depending on the day. And I was given various drugs, etc. Nothing really did any good. And then I learned to meditate with a machine. It's called biofeedback. So I was hooked up to a machine, and I learned how to deeply relax. And after that helped me control my headaches, continues to help me control headaches. And then I have used it in other ways. And actually, I don't meditate every morning. I usually do it in the afternoons.
okay.
So, but
What kind of practice is like a secular practice?
it's like a secular practice. But you're
Okay.
absolutely right that one of the benefits of what we think of broadly as meditation is that you do escape what I call the internal narrator. That little voice that's, you know, arguing in your head, or, you know, thinking about something you read, or in my case, reading. I read a lot. And meditation clears you of the insistent voices that are, you know, visiting you in, you know, in your own mind, the continual narration. So meditation and actually working in my garden when it's not wintertime. I find that I do not narrate when I'm weeding or picking leaves, or I'm just completely concentrating on the plants that are growing and living. It's fascinating. I think it has something to do with the fact that they're alive, and I'm in some mute encounter with the plants, and I don't narrate then. Isn't that interesting? And
Yes,
meditation, you clear out your brain. Yeah.
I guess different people find that experience with different things. For me, for example, it's running.
Yeah.
When I go running, I don't listen to music. Lots of people do it because I want to be focused on what my body's doing, you know?
Yeah.
And still, because if you meditate, you know that still, if you meditate, if you do a daily practice, still you're overcome by the narrator, and all of a sudden you're meditating and you think, well, for the past like 2 minutes, I've been thinking that I have to pay the electricity bill and I have to go to the store.
Yes,
and it's just
and you put it away and you start again. I think that's the thing. It's not. I mean, one of the nicer aspects, I think, of what I know about these practices is that it is not punitive. It isn't about punishing yourself for you know, having a thought, or you know, something, or being distracted. It's that you are, you know, in my case, relaxing my body and taking away a lot of tension. And once I understood how it's possible to deeply relax, and, you know, in my case, to warm my extremities. I'm very tall. You might not know that. I'm 6 feet tall.
I know.
And so so my circulation and migraine is, you know, a vascular condition. So I have learned how to warm up my hands and feet, which increases my circulation and generally helps with pain. So that feeling of agency that I talked about earlier, and control of actually having something to say about the state of my body, is a wonderful thing. And I feel very grateful for it.
Okay, I just have a couple of questions. It's Sunday. You need to go back to your life.
Yes.
And enjoy your Sunday. But you've written a lot of essays that, in a way, are a bridge between literature and arts and science. I mean, you've given talks. And you wrote profusely about it. And what I want to ask you, because that doesn't happen very often in writers, you know, the fiction writers, the interest about science, which I find very interesting. But how do you see this phase that we're going through, not only in America, but everywhere else, that science is being questioned? I don't think that science, it's like a religion that we, of course, we should question things, but
yes,
that it's like it's uncool to believe in science, or science it's the devil, or science it's an ox trying to control the population. If somebody would have told me that 5 years ago that we would be facing this kind of new dark ages, I would be appalled. I wouldn't believe it. In 2021, when, I mean, in the era of communication, that everyone has a small device that has all the knowledge produced in the world until today, and yet people are so suspicious about science. How do you see that?
Well, I think this is tied up with what we're seeing around the world, which is the rise of nativist populism, not just in the United States, very obviously in my country, but also in places in Europe, and forms of it, for example, in Modi's India. Hindu nationalists who have an agenda that is really quite similar, I think, to a lot of nativist populists elsewhere in the West. So that resistance to elites, it really is, it's across the board. It's not just science, but science in our culture does represent knowledge, difficult knowledge often, right? That people can't penetrate, you know, what scientists are talking about. It's knowledge that requires significant training. And so the resistance to expertise is also a resistance to the hierarchy that has been established. Now, we know that science has come to have control over the natural world in ways that are both wonderful and frightening, right? I mean, I like to use the two. It's very simple. Wonderful as in antibiotics that have also problems, but basically wonderful things. And, you know, the A-bomb, not so good. So we, you know, it's both and. Nevertheless, what people often forget is that, you know, there are many, many aspects of science. There are many disciplines within science. Science is a search. It's an ongoing search to supply answers to questions. Science changes all the time. Sometimes good science in the past is forgotten also. And then, you know, a certain form of bad science takes its place, and then the good science of the past is recovered again. I think people have a tendency to see science as this trajectory of progress that, you know, never ends. It just gets better and better. That really is not true. And I'm really interested in the philosophy of science too. So there are reasons that we can be critical of science. But what you're talking about is what I think of as belligerent ignorance, right? People who don't want to know. They want to take a position that, you know, my common sense, or the fact that, you know, I can't see that the planet is necessarily getting hotter, so I'm not going to believe the scientists. This, I think, is also, you know, conspiracy theories are tied up with this. We see that growing not just in the United States, but around the world. People who like conspiracy theories like them to some degree because they feel they gain greater control over their lives. They've understood the situation. They've scoped it out. You know, it's Hollywood Jews, you know, in QAnon who are actually cannibalizing children. I mean, it's hard to get how this goes over, but in fact, conspiracy theories are very, very old. You know, this is a version of medieval blood libel, where Jews were
Jewish blood libel,
right? And that, I think, I did a little research into this, was, you know, goes way back to Christian communion.
Yeah.
And the, you know, church father Tertullian wrote that he was sick and tired of Christians being accused of eating babies. And that's way before the medieval blood libel came to be. So these stories, and it's something to think about. I don't have the answer. Stories can last a long, long time. They take on different versions in a culture, but they're recreated. Think about all the stories that are just redone. Odysseus over and over again, the clever male hero.
The anti-Semitism that is on the rise.
Yeah.
It's part of the foundation of the Western civilization, just as Jesus Christ is, because one needs the other. I mean, since the Gospels, that the Jews were accused of killing Christ, in order to have a new religion, you have to demonize the other. And you were talking about the blood libels that I've read lately about them as well, especially because in Portugal and in Spain, the Jews went through hell in the 15th, in 16th centuries. And I understand that back then, when you said that in order to be pregnant, a Jewish woman would have to drink the blood of a baptized Catholic baby, that people would believe it. I just find it more difficult now that you have access to deconstruct those conspiracy theories, that you still believe in them, because back then you didn't have. I mean, you believed what you were told. Now people have more information, and still they choose to believe. And I think, like you said, it's just a way to feel more assured of themselves in a time of uncertainty. And human beings have a hard time dealing with uncertainty. They need to know what's going to happen. Not knowing something, I mean, in the beginning of the pandemic, we were all very anxious because we didn't know what was going to happen. And as time went by, I mean, now you know about the vaccine, you know a little more about the virus, and it doesn't mean that you're not anxious anymore, but it's different. And like you said, these beliefs in these theories is being part of a tribe and feeling special for having a knowledge that puts you in front of the other, and explains in a very simple way problems that are very complex, and sometimes they don't have an answer.
I think that's right. And it's what they have, you know, what I think it has in common with earlier moments in history is that it's also a way of purifying the self, right? You have absolute evil on the other side. I mean, the demonization of the Jews, but think of what the role that witches played over time in the culture, as, you know, the horror, the really horrible other. And you are able to expiate the bad feeling. Like, you think now the pandemic is bad for many people, painful, uncertainty reigns. And it's not surprising that conspiracy theories of one kind or another come to rise up in a period like this. During the plague in medieval Europe, the Jews were blamed for many, you know, for causing the plague. And in fact, Pope Clement issued 2 bulls directly stating that the Jews didn't do it. You know, the Jews were not responsible for the plague. But I think there's something in human beings that wants to blame the bad feeling in a community on a convenient other. You know, René Girard's scapegoat theory is very valuable for us now. It's that you find an innocent victim, usually someone vulnerable. You know, in my country, it's been, you know, Black people from the start. And now, you know, xenophobia, misogyny, and racism are often part of the scapegoat theory.
I'm going to be a little more mundane and quote a comedian, Dave Chappelle. He says that he understands the feeling of loss of not having what you would want to, that someone or something is messing up with your life. But he says, but that doesn't make me hate you. It just makes me hate that feeling of feeling that.
Right.
And I guess that's the difference. I mean, you have the right to feel like that, you know? You could, if you're having a hard time, if your life is difficult, you could feel like that. But you should hate the feeling, not the other, not trying to find someone to blame you for having that feeling. And once maybe people are able to rationalize their experience, like Dave Chappelle put it, maybe it's a step forward.
Yes,
not blaming the other.
Dave Chappelle is taking a very sophisticated and complex position about human feeling, and I think that, you know, the scapegoat mechanism. I mean, Girard talks about this. He said, in order for it to work, you cannot know that you're doing it, right? You cannot know. You have to believe the person is really guilty, really to blame in some way. It's not necessarily rational, but that's how it functions. And then after the person has been killed or sacrificed, the community can restore its own integrity and good feeling, feel very pure and good about themselves once they've gotten rid of the stranger. Of course, the mechanism can get going again very quickly.
Well, the idea of purity has caused a lot of pain throughout the centuries. The idea of purity, right?
Yeah.
Especially in religion. Okay, just to end this conversation in a more optimistic, even sentimental note, allow me, please.
Yes.
I've read that after being married for 38 years, you and your husband still read aloud at each other. I mean, you read books aloud. Do you still do that? And did you do that during the pandemic?
Yes, and we also, of course, we often read each other's work aloud to each other. So this ritual goes on, and yeah, we've really been married a long time now. We've been married so long that when I say it's like 39 years, and people say, "Wow." But this reading, and I think of reading to each other and, of course, talking to each other as a very, very long ongoing dialogue that we've been having, that to our great good luck has never become dull.
Well, if there are any couple therapists listening to us, maybe they can tell their patients to read to each other aloud, and that will help with their marriage, because I find it's beautiful and romantic, and it's very nice. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And congratulations for your book, for the Portuguese readers, Recordações do Futuro. You're still in time to buy it before Christmas, or order it online. And Siri, thank you very much for talking to us and taking time off your Sunday to talk to us. It was an amazing experience talking to you.
It was wonderful talking to you, and thank you for very good questions. And I had fun.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.